Thank you for coming, first off. And again, I'm Laurel Archie. I was here several weeks ago talking about modern and contemporary art at the CMA. And today we get to look at marginalized artists at the CMA. So we've got representing the underrepresented here. And it's, again, not going to go over everything, but in the next hour, just kind of some of the highlights, and we'll go into a few artists specifically in a few specific periods. So I wanted to talk a little bit initially about marginalization in the art world. So thinking about that, excluding or underrepresenting artists based on race, gender, sexuality, disability, and socioeconomic status, just to name a few. These are just some examples of what can cause marginalization for an artist. But again, for the purpose of the collection highlights at the CMA, we'll focus primarily on the first three, really. So kind of thinking about race, gender, and sexuality, and how that can create marginalization for artists. And then looking at their work and kind of how their work has affected the art world. So we'll start with some African-American artists here at the museum. And I have kind of somewhat chronologically, it kind of jumps around, but I wanted to start with this Jacob Lawrence piece, a print. So it's a screen print called the 1920s, The Migrants Cast Their Ballots, from 1974. And it's really beautiful. Even, I mean, that's the nice thing about prints, is even on a projector, you know, we're not seeing it in person, but we can really grasp kind of the color and the graphic nature of it. And this screen print really highlights a later period in Lawrence's life in the 70s, as you see, but it really goes back to his migration series, which was in the 40s. And that series consisted of 60 panels and highlighted the significance of the Great Migration. This print in particular shows the Black community exercising their right to vote in their new northern community. So other prints of the time might show culture and music of Harlem, or workers showing the type of industrial jobs they move for. But the scenes that he was trying to depict, as you can see here with something simple like casting their ballots, were really showing kind of the new life they had through the Great Migration. And also really highlighting the neighborhoods, the everyday life, and the humanity and dignity of the people in this community. So this is the piece in the museum, but I wanted to show again what it references back to is his earlier work, and some of his most famous work that he was known for is in the 40s. So the Migration series, this is actually from the Phillips collection, but it's 60 panels, paintings that show this time in America in the early to mid 1900s, when the country saw millions of African Americans moving north or northwest to cities. They migrated to escape racial discrimination and violence in the rural South and find better economic opportunity and community in the North. And that's really what he was depicting, both the process of the migration, but also the new life in these northern cities. You can see here Chicago, New York, St. Louis kind of highlighted in a train station right there. So there was a large need for labor and work in these urban areas during World War I, and the U.S. saw a loss of industrial workers. So there was this great migration to kind of find new life, find new jobs, and new community. The Migration series by Lawrence is an epic project, again, of 60 paintings. He was capturing the spirit and key aspects of the movement, its struggle, its nuances, and victories. This is actually a 12 by 18-inch tempera on hardboard. And you can see, again, that limited palette and simple overlapping of shapes that kind of create like a pattern, really, and it becomes like a bit of like a tapestry or quilt work. And the figures become part of a whole, and there's a rhythm and continuity before we hit the blue doorways to the northern cities that they're headed toward. So this is number one in the series. So again, you think about the beginning of the migration starting in rural South going north. But I think, again, the way that he has this simple palette and just again, just kind of basic shapes. It's kind of parts becoming a whole, which it really was about the community. And I think that the work really shows that, especially in this first piece. Another piece is later in the series is number 52. It says one of the most violent race riots occurred in East St. Louis from 1941. And this is at the MoMA. And in this panel, again, you see how we're able to move through time with his panels and glimpse vignettes of key moments and figures, and really marvel at just the composition. And he kind of is able to make something violent also just really beautiful with his colors and his language and composition, but really bring attention to it in this important event. And this is the second to last one, so number 59. In the North, they had the freedom to vote. And this is, again, I think a good tie-in to the piece we have here at the museum where it's showing them casting their ballots. The stories are really more accessible and poignant through these paintings and prints. His ability to masterfully tell the stories, it comes naturally. He instigates, a time when paintings, murals, other works of art are an effective use of an artist's voice in marginalized communities. So artists are really, again, using the work to say something about events that are happening politically, culturally, and socially. And he was doing this in the 40s and again, returned to it in the 70s with this print, again, that we see in the collection. So I just wanted to highlight that because I really think, I think Lawrence is so important in this movement, and he starts really early on, but continued to make work, like I said, even into the 70s, but it really started in the 40s. I think also what's important is looking back at this from the migration series in 1941, where we've got in the North, they had the freedom to vote, and we see migrants kind of lining up to access this new, really novel right to vote, which was very exciting that they could take part in their dignity and their humanity and vote. And then he returns to it here. But this being done in 1974, I think we have to think about the context too is changing. And now we've got the civil rights movement catching wind from the 60s and 70s, and it comes out of the Great Migration, but he chooses to kind of look back at where they came from. And I think that journey in his work and in history is really significant. So just want to look at that. And that's really on Lawrence. So the next artist we've got here is Romare Bearden, who I love. I have a quote here from him where he says, "This is what I try to do in my collages, to bring the Afro-American experience into art and give it a universal dimension." Bearden was another artist familiar with the Great Migration that we were just speaking of. So he was born in 1911 in Charlotte, not far from here, in Charlotte, North Carolina. But shortly after this, his parents moved up to New York City as well, so kind of like Lawrence. And that's where he grew up. But he's known for his collages, drawings, and paintings of everyday life in the American South. So even though he moved to New York, he kind of returned to those ideas of rural American South life and the African-American community there. And this occurred in his abstract paintings and later his well-known collages, which created an incredible sense of space through his combinations of colors and shapes. This is at the museum here, and it's Dreams of Exile from 1971. And again, you can see here in this print that he's showing kind of the neo-expressionist movement, a reaction against conceptual art, and having some of those representational things like the figures, the animals, and kind of the landscape. But it becomes abstracted through color and kind of the way he overlaps them, which is really similar to his collage work. And this is after his collage work, but he's kind of returning to those ideas in the print, the way he layers the shapes. He also was kind of neo-expressionist, going against abstract expressionism by showing representation, but also symbolism. You can see a lot of that just through color, again, kind of the rural South, those warm colors, but even just the language, like with the animals, you've got the flora and fauna, the snake in the middle, which can be often kind of a religious symbol or representation. This is another one by Bearden, another print we have in the collection, a lithograph called Firebirds. And again, returning to some of his collage-like aesthetics that he's known for, using line, shape, and pattern to break up the form here. There's a reference to both African-American fabric patterns as well as religious symbolism again. The firebird you can see here at the top, or the phoenix, is really related to both kind of Egyptian sun gods as well as ideas in Christianity and other religions with the idea of rebirth and kind of coming out of the ashes or being reborn. And there's also a cross you can see in that central figure. And he's again kind of celebrating that Black community with these figures together and using symbolism with the firebirds, and even thinking a little bit about being reborn from the ashes of migration and the civil rights movement. So he's using a lot of these patterns and symbols to evoke the meaning in that. But it becomes very simple and, again, much like his collage work, but in this way a print, just kind of layered and basic. This is another piece by Bearden called Quilting Time. I think the color and the layering here is really beautiful and evocative. And this kind of goes back to even further in, you think about 19th century Black American life. And so kind of like Jacob Lawrence, where he's going back and thinking about the Great Migration of the early part of the century, Bearden goes all the way back even to 19th century Black American life and these important communities that were formed, and that, even within this setting, that they're passing down crafts like quilting. And he really wants to highlight the importance of family, villages, and the passing down of these trades. And even as they're showing quilting, you can see his reference to this just in his work, like in the last one too, with the patterns that overlap, or here all the layering of the colors and the shapes, the patterns. Mm-hmm. Bearden did look at like Matisse, and he was studying in New York and looking a lot of like modern and contemporary artists. So he would have been influenced by them too. And I think, he thinks a lot about color. I think in his collage work, there's a relationship there too, because you think about Matisse kind of doing his cut paper work later in life, and he was very focused on kind of positive negative space and spatial ideas that show figure ground. And I think that Matisse and Bearden are actually so skilled with spatial concepts just in a really simple way. And so it would make sense that he would see that. And he I'm sure was looking at them, and he was working with a lot of artists in New York at the time and was exposed to that at places, galleries and museums in New York. So it would make sense. That's a good observation. So that's the last one on Bearden. But again, these prints I think are a great part of the collection, and they really, we think of his collages, but they embody a lot of what his collages do, I think spatially and in terms of layers. So moving on a little bit farther, we've got Sam Gilliam, and we can see a lot of his work right now, which is great that this kind of lines up. And he's another artist that's using printmaking and painting to create a textured, layered history of color and surface. But this one in a more abstracted way than Bearden or Lawrence. So he's really thinking about the materials. It's process-driven paintings in the 60s when artists were experimenting with showing the process of the work itself. These large paintings showing bright colors, staining the canvas, laying it on the ground, rubbing the paint into it, pouring it, and staining it, and then actually physically folding the canvas to get these kind of accordion folds and striations, and also these kind of mirrored symmetrical images that occur almost like a Rorschach, when you think about the ink and how that goes. So he was really physically working with the canvas. I think it kind of takes you back to someone like Pollock, who was pouring on the ground. But Gilliam goes kind of beyond that and doesn't just take the canvas on the ground and then lay the paint on, but he actually physically moves the canvas around. He folds it, wrinkles it, unfolds it, mounts it, and it becomes this very physical investigation of his work that as the viewer we can kind of see the history of. And I think it really shows the layering and in the process in such a new way. So he was really revolutionary in the way he was doing that. It was along with a lot of artists that were also showing process work, but I think he wasn't afraid to, again, just get very physical with the canvas. Another piece where you can see him doing this, and I think where it changes is you start to see kind of even just how the color palette changes. This one a little bit brighter, more primary. It's less atmospheric than the last one, where it's very embedded with these soft, almost celestial colors. But this one becomes, there's a lot of movement, and again, it's very bright, intense. And he takes it even further eventually by doing the Drape series, which he was one of the first Black artists to be in the Venice Biennial. So that the pieces that were in there were like this, like the canvas, but actually physically draped on the wall. So where the canvas isn't mounted and hung like a flat surface, but like more of a physical sculpture. So again, just kind of going beyond what you might expect for a painter, and really questioning the art form itself was what he was known for. So moving on, we've got Elizabeth Catlett, an incredible printmaker, sculptor, social justice advocate, and artist. As an African-American woman, she understood what it was to be marginalized in society. She used her work to shine light on civil rights and the need for Black freedom, feminism, and after moving to Mexico, the rights and needs of Mexican women as well. Catlett was born in D.C., but would eventually move to Mexico in the 40s through a fellowship. And while making a career as a Black female artist at this time was exceedingly difficult and rare, she utilized her skills as an educator and advocate to continue her constant devotion to her art and her people. Her unique voice at the time in history is still celebrated and significant today. So I wanted to look at some of her work that we have here at the museum. The first one is this lino cut. So she was a printmaker and a sculptor, which I feel like is somewhat of I usually don't see that. I feel like you see a lot of printmaker painters, but I think of one as kind of inherently 2D and then the other is 3D, but I think that her prints are so physical, and that's nice to see. Like in this one, I think the sharecropper from 1945, you can really see the physicality of the carving in the linoleum and that rustic quality of the marks, kind of relating to that intense physical labor of an oppressed working class community. And so she's really using the medium almost, again, kind of physically like a sculptor would. And so it's a flat print, but it comes from, again, a dimensional form that she starts with printmaking. And I think that shows also in her sculpture. So this is called Reclining Nude, and it's a bronze from 1955. So again, she was an established sculptor using marble, wood, bronze, and she really wanted to show the strength, power, and femininity of the Black female form. Here in the pose, we see the kind of the self-assured body language. You can see facing us, and you can walk around this, but even walking around it, not confronted with kind of the profile or the face, you can just see the structure and sort of the again, the stable kind of presence. There's a strength to it, I think, and even in the materials she uses, having this cast in bronze, she wants to really show that confidence and power of the form. There's a self-assured body language, contact with the viewer, but also a softness and humanity. Her work showed the complexity of the people she represented. And she lived this portrayal of confidence and strength, becoming the first African-American woman to receive an MFA in 1940 from the University of Iowa, which I think is really incredible. And again, she, at a time where it was difficult to be just a female artist or, a female African-American artist, she used her MFA and she taught and she worked in education and she worked again, she moved to Mexico and worked with the Mexican people, and she just continued to do whatever she could do to continue making her art. And I think she had such a strong spirit to continue making, even when, odds were against her. This was another work called Madonna, and from 1982, so a little bit later, but at the University of Iowa, where she did get her MFA in 1942, she really started to explore themes of African-American women and children through the advice of her instructor, who's Grant Wood. So, we think of Grant Wood and American Gothic, and he was teaching there in the Midwest, and he told her to use what was familiar with what was familiar to her as subject matter. So she really continued to revisit these themes of kind of women, African-American women and children, And in this lithograph, we kind of see the reference to that Renaissance Madonna and Child iconography that we're used to seeing in European artwork. But now it's reappropriated in the scene through the lens of the African-American woman and her role as mother, caregiver, and gentle nurturer of her children. Even just, I think, the composition, so that church-like dome kind of around her head really gives her a heightened reverence. And the graphic hard lines show that strength, again, combined with the soft curving femininity, much like the sculpture we just saw. And here we have Betty Saar. I think it's really fun that we have one of her pieces as well, a print, but she's known for her assemblages. And this is The Long Memory from 1998. Saar is really a true modern artist and champion of civil rights, best known for her assemblage sculptures, which depict objects specific to African-American life, whether showing their oppression and roles as laborers or the stereotypes made in caricatures of Black people. Her combination of objects or imagery question the inappropriate labeling or positioning of African-American people in society and reveal the injustices, past and present. Her work is curious, tactile, and investigative. I think, she's so inventive the way she pulls different materials and puts them together. And she takes the viewer kind of into her own understanding or experience with these physical objects. In the screen print, she's using layering and found imagery to show the various makeup of African-American culture through symbolic color, textures, and iconography. So you can see the little form here at the hand and other symbolic gestures and textures of things that she found. The next artist, somewhat similar in terms of just unlikely materials, but Willie Coles, so Man Spirit Mask from 1999. So actually similar time period too. So here you've got, again, the photo etching of his portrait. You've got the screen print here with lemon juice and scorching on paper, and then the mask, the photo etching and color woodcut that's layered over his portrait, which is then kind of reversed. So just really creative in terms of materials. I think he's thinking about everyday objects like steam irons, ironing boards, and household goods that have a range of associations, even including things from slave ships, African art, domestic labor, and found objects of Dada and Surrealist movements. So in the left panel, you can see a manipulated black and white photograph overlaid with embossed outline and these kind of scar-like markings of a steam iron. And then in the center, you see the rendered brown tones with blurred edges, referencing those kind of scorched surfaces on his face. And then at the right, more of kind of the bird's eye view of an antique dry iron with a wooden handle that resembles the African mask that we might think of. And it's placed upside down again on his portrait. So he's really intentional about appropriating these things that are similar, as just in terms of visuals, but also make us question kind of how they're put together and their history in terms of the African-American experience all the way back to slavery through the 20th century. And I think it's done just really masterfully in terms of just visually. I think in terms of like a triptych, it works really well and it's very subtle, but also in terms of meaning, there's a lot of depth there as well. And then moving up towards more recent work, you all may know Tyrone Geter, an artist local to Columbia. This is I Done Tired, But I Ain't No Ways Done from 2013. And seeing his work, I've got to see a lot of it in person at the Koger Center a few years back, and it's really powerful. They're very large charcoal drawings, and then he manipulates the paper as well, and they're just very physical, and they're very poignant in the poses and the way he kind of honors the figures that he's drawing and his subjects. I think he really captures their pose and their expression and kind of their hardship. And he says he's inspired a lot by his mother and just kind of showing the hardship of the African-American experience in their life and using, again, the expression, the materials, and even the way he kind of tears up and works with the paper to show that that struggle. The next section I wanted to look at was female artists. So we've got, again, somewhat chronologically, we'll go through, but looking at this one all the way back from 1895. So Evelyn de Morgan is what she goes by, her full name's here. And she was a British artist born into British society. So more privileged than a lot of the other artists we'll look at. But as a woman, she did have her share of obstacles at this time in the art world. Her family wanted her to be presented as a young lady in Victorian society. And she said she didn't want to be an idle woman. She said she instead wanted to be an artist because art is eternal. She enrolled in art school, and through various connections with family and travel, she was inspired by Botticelli and the pre-Raphaelite movement. She was a spiritualist and embodied a lot of these ideas in her work. So you can see really in this with kind of the angel figure showing the spiritual, the celestial, and otherworldly, just even in her kind of color palette. And again, thinking back to Botticelli, like with images that you might conjure of like Venus and the birth of Venus and a lot of these very, pre-Raphaelite ideas of the celestial and otherworldly imagery with the lighting and these kind of angel-like figures. De Morgan was also a suffragette and part of the movement to gain women's rights during the turn of the century. And here we have Katia Kollwitz, who was the fifth child of a working-class socialist family in Germany, or then Prussia, in the 19th century. So she studied art and became interested in the realism movement that would have been common at that time, just showing people as they really were in the vast majority of society. She married Karl Kollwitz, a doctor, and he was often working with poorer people of Berlin. She found this really inspirational to her work, seeing the type of poor community that he worked with, and she said that she found the lower class people inspiring and beautiful, choosing them as the main subject of her work. Le Carmagnole is actually a French revolutionary song, and this was said to have been inspired by Charles Dickens' depiction of that revolution in A Tale of Two Cities. So she's kind of taking from that lore, but it's actually more German or Prussian architecture. So they think she was kind of appropriating it to her own area and considering a German revolution that they might be hopeful for in gaining rights of the working people. So she was, a female artist, but also really a socialist and someone who was kind of for revolution and for the working people. And I think that her prints are just, they're all very, they make me think of Munch really, but they're very expressive. And they can be very dark, but they have a certain mood, and they also show, I think, a sense of, the industrial working class. They all feel a little bit almost overworked and labored in the way she kind of carves in and depicts the figures. Next, we have another female artist, Caroline Guignard, local to Columbia. So she studied art in Columbia before going to New York to study with William Merritt Chase in Florence in Italy. And she really shows the influence, I think, of American Impressionism, where American Impressionism, a little bit later than when you think about French Impressionism or the European movement. So this one's 1915, so kind of past that late 1890s heyday of European Impressionism. And the difference really being that American Impressionism looked a lot at landscapes, but also at kind of the upper class domesticity, so a little different than kind of the working people that you might see when you think of like the field workers or things like that in European Impressionism. But also the pure, vibrant color that was used, I think, is really clear here with kind of the blues. And then also in this painting of the Congaree River Bridge, again, just really almost straight out of the tube, the palette here that's used, a lot of full, rich colors, and probably done what looks like in plein air as well. So kind of from the spot right over here of the Congaree River Bridge. Mm-hmm.
Did she have any association with the earlier print with the still hopes of retirement? She did.
Yeah, and I don't know the history of that. I did see, because this one says Still Hopes, and yeah, so the area would be there. That's right, yeah.
It was her plantation.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that tidbit. Yeah. I'm limited mostly to what her work is, but she does, I know, have quite a history in Columbia. So Ann Coles is the next artist I want to look at, who's another local Columbia artist. Studied actually at Columbia College, where I teach, but moved on to Converse and eventually New York, and showed at the Art Institute in Chicago and also the Pennsylvania Institute of Fine Arts in Philadelphia before heading back to South Carolina, where she called home for the rest of her life. So she did come back here, and she worked during World War II on with the Merchant Marine making mechanical drawings. So I thought that was really interesting, just kind of her place as a female during the war, still kind of aiding to the cause and using her art. She also made over 100 commissioned portraits, several of which reside at the museum, like this one of Dr. Robert Waller Gibbs, and then this one, the Striped Matinee, and this other portrait. And I think especially in this one, you really see, again, the influence of American Impressionism, kind of focused on that upper class domesticity, the painterly marks, the use of white, and kind of the mixing of that lighter pastel palette makes me think of even like Renoir or Mary Cassatt, who would have been an influence on a lot of these artists at the time in the American Impressionist movement. And so the next one, Hilda Belcher, with this scarlet and blue. Also, I think, thinking of that influence from Mary Cassatt and those domestic interiors, and especially with that intimate female domesticity, which prior to this wasn't being shown as much in artwork and in paintings. I think Belcher's work especially sticks out to me just because it is a little more natural. The other ones being portraits, you can see they're a little more posed and a little more careful. They're often commissioned. I think that was just how she was able to continue making work. But I think when you see someone like Belcher, who's really looking at kind of these natural scenes, it's almost more like genre painting, or it kind of captures a moment. Here, again, 1926, you can just see, I think even just kind of the natural quality of it, it feels less posed, the way the fabric is, the way the items on the table are. It's a little bit more about almost back to where you think of Impressionism as the impression of the moment, or just what you're seeing at that time, and kind of capturing that moment. Kira Markham is another artist, I think, not as much American Impressionism, but more American regionalism or social realism. In 1945 was more a period she was influenced by. So we think of kind of like Grant Wood, American Gothic, or Andrew Wyeth, Christina's World, and kind of these sentimental characteristics of everyday life in America. So she's got the square dance here. So again, maybe kind of sentimental American life here that she's showing. But I think Markham is also an actress, and I think she kind of gets this sort of theatrical quality to the work, the way she has just the facial expressions and the dancing and the postures. So I think she really shows that and uses that in her work. And she also took part in propaganda art against the Nazis during World War II. So really using her gifts as a woman and a female artist. The next one is Andre Ruellin, and she was a painter that began as a social realist, but as you can see in this painting from 1969, she really took to a more modernist approach, using abstraction to break up everyday scenes. And she also ended up moving to France and was really inspired by French modern art. This French scene where she really starts to break up shapes, and it becomes about color and kind of the repetition of form. And she's starting to kind of question just the traditional way of representing the scene. Marguerite Stix is another female artist we have in the collection, born in Austria in 1904, but she was fleeing the Nazis in 1938 when she moved to Paris. So moving to Paris, she started working with fashion design, and that really inspired a lot of her work later on. She was taken to a concentration camp, but having survived after the war, she moved to New York City. So that is when she kind of became known for her work in New York, working with jewelers and Cartier. She and her husband collected, I think, over 15,000 shells specimens, and that would be part of her shell jewelry that Cartier would buy. But she also did a lot of sculpture, as you can see here, from Leaning Woman from 1959. And I think with this piece and her other ones, you can also see the influence of Giacometti, who, she probably would have been influenced by him as well as other surrealists during her time in Paris. And you can see that with kind of these elongated figures. But she really, as opposed to Giacometti, who has these elongated figures that are very still and sort of sad, hers feel much more alive and have this vitality and interaction, often with multiple figures, like this one with Paolo and Francesca, or this one called The Jump. So I think she was looking at artists, but I think she really becomes one of her own, the way she depicts these figures, and also, again, the way she was able to work with jewelry design as well. The next artist is Ida Kohlmeyer, born to Polish immigrants in Louisiana in 1912. She took up art in her 30s and moved to New York to get her MFA, where she studied under Hans Hofmann. And I think you can see that Hans Hofmann influence here with the colors, the abstraction, the palette, and really the grid-like square. Hoffman influenced her choice to become more abstract and remove representation in her work. She also spent time traveling in Mexico, and that you can see really influenced her palette, the use of symbols, shapes, and patterns. And this composition 94 to 35, I think, shows her interest in that and the way she kind of, again, uses that grid that Hoffman would have used, but kind of layers the paint. The contrast, the simultaneous contrast of the colors, kind of that orangey against the purple, and the way she's using her palette, and the way Mexican artists would have used it that she saw when she was traveling there. I think her sculpture too is really incredible. She wasn't recognized till later in life, but she really continued to make work and grow her work. She's known for a lot of large-scale sculptures, like this one that we have at the museum, slanted number 7. She also did commissions for public spaces. I think her work is really, again, also in a category of its own. It's inventive and persistent, and I think she wasn't recognized till later, but she just kept making work. And I know for me, I feel like it's, as an artist, I think you always want to be recognized early on, but whether or not you are, it didn't stop her from making the work. And it happened for her later, but the work was just as valuable early in her life as it was, later. She just continued to grow.
How large is it? Is it like
This one, probably 6 feet or over. Yeah, the size of a human figure or larger. So it does have a presence. It doesn't, I know on the screen looks like it could just sit on a tabletop, but they're quite large. And a lot of her commissioned pieces were very large installations as well. Yes, yeah. Yeah, so in kind of the entrance that goes to Main Street, it's, I think, on the left or right, yeah. Yeah, so it's right there, and you can see it on your way out. All right, so that's Ida Kohlmeyer. And then Beverly Buchanan had an interesting and untraditional background as well. She was born in North Carolina, but was sent to live with her aunt and uncle in Orangeburg, after her parents divorced. Her uncle was a dean and professor at SC State University, and her aunt was a school principal. So she really had a lot of education that she was immersed in, and she actually went to study public health at Columbia University in New York, but it was while she was there and about to go to medical school that she decided to be an artist, of all things. So that also encouraged me, just that she was drawn to her art. And going back to actually Romare Bearden, who we looked at earlier, she became part of that African-American artist collective that he formed called Spiral, and she was able to study under Bearden. And you can really see, I think, Bearden's influence, thinking about his collages and his layering in this piece of hers, just with the way the colors are and the textures. This is part of her most well-known series called the Shack series. This is Frank Owen's Blue Shack from 1989. She's depicting poor housing using bright colors and found materials. So really starting to create a sense of warmth and home amidst kind of what's perceived as kind of a negative space or building, but showing again kind of the beauty of it and that it's steeped in memories and meaning. And then actually, in terms of color, that's kind of a nice segue. But this one is Sandy Skoglund, so another artist who uses color but in a different way. She's known for her theatrical installations, as you can see from this one, A Breeze at Work. These sets are used in her photography, so it's very involved and performative. She creates these installations and spaces in museums and in galleries, but she also sets them up in her studio as here, and then she would photograph them. She began more of a conventional trajectory studying art, but in the 70s, she became a conceptual artist and used photography to document her process and experiment with posing and creating scenes. That was early on. I think now that's very common, but I think she also was sort of revolutionary as a female artist doing this and setting up the scenery and using photography in a little bit of an unconventional way. So the photos are part of the work, but it's not traditional photography like you might think of. It's more about the installation and kind of the event, or again, the theatrical part of that. And that's why she also is known for her installations. She kind of broke the mold in terms of her medium. And the work evolves and continues to inspiring other women and artists to use more unlikely mediums and the presentation of materials. I think she really makes us question everyday objects, our memory and sense of place by setting up, installing, and photographing these scenes. You can see just even here, like the desk, the office setting, the little phone. Again, things that in 1987, this could actually be just a very typical office setting, but then with the use of color and obviously the wild leaves and the breeze at work, if you will, like the blue leaves that come into play, it becomes about something else entirely and makes us kind of question those spaces and what might be happening internally as well as externally. Another photographer who uses photography in a different way, probably more traditional way, is Sally Mann. And this is from the collection Virginia Untitled, or vase is what it's known as you can see the little vase or vessel in the middle, from 1992. Sally Mann, probably best known for her black and white film photography depicting her children in rural Virginia. But I think she also did a lot of natural spaces and landscapes in her scenic hometown. I've read some of her writing, and she really is tied to her sense of place. She grew up in Virginia, and she continues to live there now, even as she shows nationally and internationally. And I think that her work is really about that place. It's about, form and light, but childhood and nature. And her landscapes, like this one, we get an overwhelming sense of that kind of quiet southern feeling. The atmosphere, the air even feels kind of heavy and warm, as we all know, like that feeling of humidity. But it's kind of thick with memory and dust. And she uses photography and continues to use it with kind of an honest voice to show that sense of space in her home life. But through the camera lens, kind of captures more poignant moments. Julie Heffernan, another female artist that is using self-portraiture. Here's self-portrait of St. Teresa in Exile. I think, again, just a contemporary artist really combining unexpected imagery. These are little vignettes of suburban landscapes among a group of apples, as you can see. So again, this is where the work starts to be a little bit more self-referential or autobiographical. A lot of contemporary artists, as opposed to talking about society, talking more about their personal life, which, I think we think about autobiographical or self-portraits being somewhat maybe specific or limited, but I think they can also, in their vulnerability, show more of a general understanding that people can relate to. I think when someone tells you their story, you can sense some of the feeling in that and relate to it, even if it's not your story. So I think this is something we see a lot more in contemporary art, and especially with these marginalized artists who have specific stories. Leslie Dill, another female artist who uses woven paper and thread. She really recalls the heritage of crafts that she grew up seeing and family members who sewed and quilted and woodworked. This is a lithograph on tea-stained woven paper with paper and thread. So she's kind of thinking about these materials and these domestic materials, even the tea staining or the thread that's woven through it. She also has language and quotes sometimes from poetry because she's an avid reader as well. And then the last female artist here, Jennifer McCurdy, in this porcelain wave vessel, which I think if you look at it just to think of it as porcelain, I think this is really an example of contemporary art playing with materials, questioning the objects, questioning its essence, like someone like Jeff Koons does, and a lot of artists today do by thinking about the vessel, which looks here kind of fluid and soft, but it's made of porcelain, which is so fragile and so hard. So it's kind of questioning how we see and understand something as the viewer, the physicality of it as a sculpture, and even the nature of it, which it's a vessel, yet it's, as you can see, has these holes, so it wouldn't really hold anything solid like water. So kind of, again, asking questions with the work. And that's the female artist. There's a few more marginalized that I wanted to look at in terms of queer artists and other minorities. So starting back, I think, with Eileen Gray, we've got this one that everyone knows. Even my son saw this and he said, "Oh, I know that from the museum." So just thinking about a designer, designer Eileen Gray, a great influence in the mid-century design, combining structure, softness, and kind of a restrictive geometric frame with this curving ergonomic seat. And she really, I think, shows the beauty of contrast in unexpected ways with the way that frame kind of embodies that organic, natural shape. And she really was an influence on the modernist movement, mid-century furniture design, and really valued kind of utility and mathematical principles over overly ornamentational work. The next artist is Italian immigrant Luigi Lucioni. He was an Italian immigrant in the early 1900s and came from kind of a poor Italian family that came through Ellis Island hoping to escape difficult economy in northern Italy. He was 6 years old and took several years to learn English. He experienced bigotry and being sidelined in America, but continued to work on his studies and his art. At 15, he won a competition for admission to Cooper Union, where he would study at night while working during the day. So I think, again, another great example of an artist who's just really dedicated to his work despite his situation and his hardships. I think his work really shows a concern for detail, and he would have described himself as a super realist. But I think, coming from Italian background, probably having, even for a short time, grown up in Italy and seeing a lot of Italian Renaissance work, you can see that that influence just in the way he handles the paint and the way he has all this detail and textures, the curtain, the wallpaper, all the different surfaces. He's very precise. And in the 1920s and 30s, he really found his place among other gay men in the West Village of Manhattan. He wasn't public about his sexuality, but was able to find a place in among other marginalized artists in the city. And he did many of these coded gay portraits at a time when homosexuality was not overtly accepted. Certain clothing, facial features, posture, and styling would reference the subject's queerness. So here, this is his friend and another artist, Paul Cadmus, from 1928. So you can see just even the kind of posing, I think even the facial features, the tie, the colors, there was, again, kind of a coded language to show that. So Lucioni was marginalized really as an immigrant, working class, and a gay man, but his work ethic and commitment to his art, I think, really stands out in this, among other stylized work at the time. The next artist is Ben Zion Weinman, and we have this piece, Chrysanthemum, at the museum from 1952. Another American immigrant born at the turn of the 19th century, but from Russia, not Italy. He's of Jewish descent. He suffered anti-Semitism in 1914 when he tried to study at the Academy in Vienna. And eventually he moved to the United States, where he taught Hebrew in New York. And in the 30s, he continued painting. He was largely self-taught as a result, again, of anti-Semitism, not being able to study when he was in Europe. But he was a founding member of the 10, the Expressionist group, with Mark Rothko and Adolf Gottlieb, among others. And he was able to work with these artists to really establish himself as an American expressionist. And you can see in this painting just kind of, I mean, even the composition itself, and I think the scale and the painting, it's so vertical and it's so unusual, but I think he really is thinking about form and kind of those dark, crude lines. He's exploring kind of surface and texture, and something as simple as an interior with flowers. He's kind of working the paint a lot and looking at this movement in the 20th century. So the next artist that I couldn't forget would be Jasper Johns. And this is Target from 1973, a print that we have among other ones of his here. I think Johns really, he began depicting these recognizable objects like the target or the flag. And this was when pop art was really taking speed. Johns grew up here in South Carolina, spent time at USC, and we're lucky to have not only his work, but work that he's gifted to the museum by other artists. One of them, his partner for a time, Robert Rauschenberg, and I'll look at a couple of those as well. With Target, I think he's repurposing something familiar in a new way. And by doing that, we really pay more attention to the materials, the brushwork, and even just by seeing the target vaguely in there, but instead of using red and white or even like black and white, like a value change, it's all gray. And that really, again, makes us look more at the materials and less at the target itself. These artists really wanted to draw attention to the art for what it was. Not that it's, something like being used to depict something else, as patrons had commissioned portraits before, but that this is art, that it's about the work, that it's about the paint, that it's about the materials and the brushwork, and even about the artists, that you can see their hand in it. And then the familiar flag, I think, I wanted to include that as well, just because that was a precursor to the Target print series that we have here at the museum. And I think there's an immediacy and economy to just the source imagery. He said with the flag series, he didn't have to think about the design. It was already designed. We know what a flag looked like. So he could focus more on the materials, the quality of the paint, the texture, the layering of, different items like newspaper. And he could, express himself with that as opposed to being tying into just the design of it. And this was gifted from Johns. It's Elephant by Robert Rauschenberg. And I think really also shows kind of the height of abstract expressionism, where we see that textural, non-representational way of making that Johns was doing, and also Rauschenberg here. Those chaotic marks, that vague expressionism almost shows like a figure or shape, maybe an elephant, maybe not, but we're more concerned with the materials and the making than the actual object. And this one by Rauschenberg, Plot, starts to show influences of pop art. His work took this turn after he visited Warhol's studio in 1962, so this is from 1967, and he really saw how Warhol was using materials and reappropriating them, like you see with these photos, with even the paper bag, how he was using printmaking and kind of reproducing things and repeating things, and using consumer materials as pop artists did, to question that line between what is the object and what is the art. This one too, I think he started to do screen printing after seeing Andy Warhol's screen prints, and adopted this process to kind of use in his own work. He also took a trip to India around this time, where he was really inspired by the fabrics, so had a lot of fabric and screen printing in his work. This one I love, my kids love it too, but Cross Ties. And this is when he started to really become more enamored with using natural materials. So we think about dirt and resin, and being bound in this fiberglass sculpture that goes on the wall. I think his work really expanded beyond painting and printmaking with things like this, where we think about kind of his combined objects, and something like the tire tracks that become embedded, and it becomes this visceral sculpted experience that's memorialized with a simple symmetrical X in resin. it's appropriated to fine art as we see it on the wall, as opposed to if it was just on the ground and it was dirt. So again, just questioning what taking something and laying it on the wall makes us look closer. And then here we have, of course, as I've been mentioning, Andy Warhol, who we have to point out with this pop art movement. And I think, while many other queer artists at the time weren't disclosing their sexuality, like Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, Warhol was a person who lived out, I think, his whole being, whether it was performative or, authentic. There may be a question of it, but I think he was a personality and certainly an artist and a character and a visionary. He was really one of the biggest influences of pop art, and one might argue even American contemporary art. And I think he used his factory, his repetition, his use of screen printing and appropriation to not only question, again, consumerism and American culture, but also, political dominant figures like Mao here in this one, where he thinks about a dictator and how he gets reproduced and put into power by people who are kind of reproducing his ideas and kind of reproducing him, but also calling attention to that with the language of the print and the color. And then just a few more towards the end of this time period, it's Fairfield Porter. So a lot different than the last few pop artists we looked at. I think Porter really rejected the sensibilities of colorful pop art and commercial objects in favor of figural representation. He looked back at French modernists like Bonnard or Vuillard, but instead of looking at domestic interiors like those French artists, he was thinking about the American landscape, which really makes him stand out again as an American painter. The broad expanses, the palette, the muted palette he used that was much more natural, and the images of the Northeast as opposed to kind of the busy cityscapes of Paris make him a more postmodern landscape painter. His vision really stood out at this time when artists weren't doing perceptual painting, they weren't doing representational painting, and he chose to do that, and I think it still holds up, and we have this piece at the museum, and I think Porter's recognized even today by a lot of perceptual painters who paint from life and try to paint really honestly. I think just the economy of his work too, what he can say with so little, how it is a whole dynamic landscape, yet it's just also just a few marks and a few different colors. He really was a master at his material with paint. And then Mel Rosas, I wanted to include as well, since he's a Panamanian American artist and struggled with complex origins, being of two cultures, the complexity being the source of much of his work's content. We see him returning to ideas of surrealism, which was made popular by other Latin artists like Salvador Dali, and using this idea of the unconscious dreams to tie in what he knows on both conscious and unconscious levels about his identity. In this one, El Oceano, we continue to see him creating a dreamscape and using the street motif to give surroundings of what feels warm and linked to Panama, but also references to the American past like Coca-Cola and these childlike objects, the chair and the beach ball. The checkerboard floor tells us of an interior, but it's tied to the ocean, and just kind of showing that there's many parts to the whole as you go through the scenes and the spaces in his work. I think Mel Rosas is another example of how an artist uses their marginalized place in society as a Latin American to actually influence and inspire their work. I think, without his particular story and his struggles, the complexity of these paintings would never have happened. So really using the very nature of why he's marginalized to influence the work and to propel the work forward. And then the last artist here I have is Stephen Nafa, and again, we know his work well because if you walked in through the front plaza, you saw it. So this one, which is right outside again in the plaza, and it's a large sculptural work from 2013. I think, he's an Arab American queer artist and Pulitzer Prize winning author whose work continues to take from art history and cultural influence to create new conversations and interactions with the viewer in a way that, physical sculptures often do. He studied art history at Princeton and Harvard and found his focus on modern and European art intersected with the Islamic art he grew up seeing in the Middle East. Where he was born. So here you can see the geometry of form and kind of that classical lapis blue color that extend the work into the viewer's space. I think, it's interesting, again, that he studied art history and is this working artist and also author. He does a lot of different things, but I think that his work is very complex because of that and has a lot carried into it and references a lot of his background. Which I think often happens with marginalized artists and brings a lot to the table there. So this other work that you probably have seen is made up of these mirrored chrome panels. So 60 steel boxes using mirrored tiles to continue to reflect and repeat from the outside as the individual boxes already begin to do on the wall. His influences from, again, ancient Eastern art and the concept of geometric art represent universal harmony. Yes? Yes.
How does it work that is at our museum? Does he contact you
Oops.
and say, hey, I've got something you might like, or?
Yes. Usually at this scale, they are site specific. And that's what a lot of his work is. So he's still working when he's actually got a lot of, like this piece would be site specific. And then at, I think it's in, he's got in a lot of different places, even globally. I want to say in site specific. So he knows the location it will be in and he's creating it. Exactly. Yeah. So as opposed to kind of having created in his studio and then it being found and then brought over here. Which sometimes happens, but usually at the scale of a lot of, like his work in particular, it's often made knowing where it will go. Right. Yes. Now something like this one, I think moved to different places in the museum and can be moved. It obviously has to be, it's all on the wall and it can be moved and it could be site specific. And he does a lot of pieces that are very similar to this one with, they're not all chrome or reflective, but some of them are site specific, like on the floors of buildings that he made knowing they would stay there. And some are like this one where it could be moved to a different wall in the museum. So something like this might be, another museum might see this and buy this without it being site specific. But I think at the scale of a sculpture like this is kind of more of almost like public art or installation is how you might think of it. But he, concerning his work, said repeated systematically across the surface, these essential geometric units create not only a marvelous wealth of patterns, but also a worldly reflection of the order of creation. So I quoted that because I couldn't have said it better myself. But I think he really looks at Eastern art and kind of the use of pattern, mathematical devices that you see in Islamic art. And I think he uses them in such a new and fresh way. I think these are really fun to interact with. This is an example of something that doesn't work as well on the projector, but I'm sure y'all have seen and can go interact with this one in the plaza. My 9-year-old son actually even loves standing in front of this one and just seeing all the reflections. I think it's another example of how art can just really be specific to the place and be specific to the viewer and how it can be kind of a conversation. So I love that about his work and that he comes from, maybe a more marginalized position, but is really helping expose and integrate some of the non-Western ideas of our global past, like these kind of Islamic patterns and Eastern European work. And then the last thing I wanted to say was just in terms of supporting marginalized artists, I think that what that does and the museum holding these pieces has counters stigmas and bigotry. It expands our understanding of art, encourages future artists, I think, especially for artists to see themselves in prior artists who were marginalized and were making work. and creates a more full, diverse art world. So I think it really creates a rich tapestry to have a variety of makers and who have a variety of pasts and place and stories. And I think that the museum really celebrates that. And I know I love seeing and hearing about all their different stories. And I hope you did today as well. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much.